The wire transfer cleared at 4:47 in the afternoon. I remember the exact time because I was standing outside Canoe restaurant on King Street, watching the February wind push a Tim Hortons cup across the sidewalk, and my phone buzzed in my coat pocket. I pulled it out with one hand, while pressing the other against my ear, trying to catch what my lawyer was saying over the traffic noise. $62,400,000. After all fees, after taxes set aside, after everything. I said thank you. I hung up. I stood there for a moment, looking at a city I'd spent 31 years building something in, and I don't know what I felt, not what I expected. I went back inside. My son-in-law was refilling his own wine glass without asking anyone. My daughter was laughing at something on her phone, and I sat down at my chair, picked up the menu I'd already read twice, and decided to order the Arctic char. Let me back up. I built a cold storage and logistics company out of nothing. Started in 1993 with a leased warehouse in Mississauga and one refrigerated truck I shared with a partner who quit after 8 months. By the time I sold, we had 14 facilities across Ontario, Quebec, and Alberta, contracts with 3 of the major grocery chains, and a fleet of 62 vehicles. It wasn't glamorous work. It was early mornings, broken compressors, staff turnover, regulatory headaches, and years of margins so thin you could see through them. But I built it, and it was mine. And last February, I sold it to a private equity firm out of Calgary for more money than I ever thought I'd see in my life. My wife Barbara passed 9 years ago, ovarian cancer. We found out in March, and she was gone by November. After that, it was just me and our daughter, who I will call Nadine, and the company. In that order, though. I'm not sure the order always showed. Nadine is 34. She's bright. She knows how to present herself. She has Barbara's eyes. She married a man named Garrett 6 years ago. Garrett sells commercial real estate. He's the kind of man who gives you a firm handshake and looks you just slightly past the eye when he does it. And you spend the rest of the day trying to figure out why you feel vaguely unsettled. I never trusted him. I want to be honest about that. I didn't trust him before any of this happened, but a father doesn't say that out loud. You keep your mouth shut and you pass the potatoes. The dinner was Nadine's idea. She'd booked the table 3 weeks in advance, said she wanted to celebrate properly, said we should treat ourselves. I appreciated that. I was 63 years old and I'd just closed the biggest transaction of my life and I thought, all right, yes, let's have dinner. Let's be a family for an evening. I drove myself downtown, parked on Wellington, walked over. They were already there when I arrived. Nadine with a glass of sparkling water and Garrett with his jacket folded over the back of his chair like he owned the room. We ordered. We talked. It was pleasant enough. Garrett asked several detailed questions about the transition timeline, the earn-out structure, whether I'd signed a non-compete. I answered them. It didn't strike me as strange at the time. Or maybe it did and I was choosing not to let it. Somewhere around the appetizers, my phone rang. It was my accountant. I'd been waiting on a confirmation related to the escrow holdback. I excused myself and stepped away from the table. I walked toward the hostess station, stood near the window, took the call. It lasted maybe 4 minutes. On my way back to the table, a young man in a white dress shirt stepped into my path. He was maybe 25, dark hair, carrying a bread basket. He looked directly at me and spoke very quietly. He said, "I'm sorry to stop you, sir. I don't know how to say this, but when you stepped away, I saw your son-in-law put something into your wine glass. I don't know what it was. I thought you should know." I looked at him. He wasn't nervous in the way someone lying would be nervous. He was nervous in the way a person is nervous when they've decided to do the right thing and aren't sure how it's going to land. I said, "Thank you." I said it quietly. I said, "Please go about your evening." I walked back to the table. My heart was doing something strange, some combination of disbelief and a cold, settling clarity. I sat down. I looked at my wine glass. I looked at Garrett, who was cutting into his steak with the focused attention of a man who has never done anything wrong in his life. I looked at Nadine, who was smiling at me. I picked up my glass. I said I needed to step away one more time, but the accountant had a follow-up question. I stood up. I reached for Garrett's glass to move it, just making room, I said. And in doing so, I set my glass down in front of him. I took his glass with me. I walked to the washroom. I poured the contents of his glass down the sink. I looked at myself in the mirror for a long moment. Then I went back out. I sat down. I drank water. I ate my Arctic char. I made conversation. Garrett refilled from the wine bottle. 40 minutes later, he said he felt unwell. He didn't look unwell. He looked frightened. There's a difference. He excused himself from the table, and within 2 minutes, Nadine's phone rang. I watched her face change as she listened. She stood up very quickly and said Garrett was in the lobby and something was wrong. I followed her out. He was on a bench near the coat check. Pale, hands shaking, sweating through his collar. He was conscious and speaking, but his words weren't lining up correctly. Someone at the front desk had already called 911. When the paramedics arrived, they asked him what he'd taken, and he said he hadn't taken anything. One of the paramedics looked at me and I said I didn't know what happened, which was the most carefully true sentence I have ever spoken. At the hospital, I sat in the waiting area for 3 hours. Nadine sat beside me for the first hour, then moved across the room. At some point, she stopped looking at me entirely. The tests came back showing traces of a sedative compound. Something prescribed, something that could be obtained. The attending physician asked Garrett directly whether he had a prescription for it. He did not. He had no explanation for how it was in his system. He was discharged the following morning. Nothing criminal happened that night. Not yet. I went home. I did not sleep. What I did instead was think, carefully, about the 3 weeks leading up to that dinner. Small things I'd filed away without examining. Garrett asking, twice, about the power of attorney I'd set up when Barbara was sick. Whether it was still in effect, whether it named Nadine. An email he'd sent, which I'd forwarded to my lawyer without mentioning why, asking about the terms under which my estate planning documents could be revisited. Nadine on a Sunday phone call, asking in a tone that was trying to be casual whether I'd thought about simplifying my investments now that the sale was done. I called my lawyer the next morning. Not about the dinner. Not yet. I asked him to quietly review my estate documents and tell me if anything had been changed, attempted, or accessed without my knowledge. He called back that afternoon and said that 3 weeks prior, someone had contacted his office, impersonating a representative from my financial institution, requesting copies of documents. His office had flagged it and not complied. He'd assumed it was a clerical error and hadn't mentioned it. It was not a clerical error. Over the next 6 weeks, with the help of my lawyer and a forensic accountant, the lawyer brought in, we traced what Garrett had actually been doing for the previous 4 months. He had incorporated a numbered company in Alberta. He had opened accounts. He had been in contact with a woman who, it turned out, was his girlfriend of 2 years. Someone Nadine did not know existed. The plan, as best we were able to reconstruct it, was this. Garrett would get access to my financial accounts during the post-sale period, when large amounts were moving between institutions and any anomalies might be obscured by the noise of the transaction. He would move funds incrementally, and I was supposed to be sedated that evening, not dead, just impaired enough that my signature on documents he had already prepared would go unquestioned. He had prepared documents. I spent a long time sitting with that fact before I could move past it. My daughter didn't know everything. I believe that. Because believing otherwise is something I'm not willing to do. What she knew, I think, was that Garrett had a plan to access money. I think she told herself a version of it that she could live with. I think she looked the other way, at details that should have alarmed her, because she wanted what was at the end of it. That's the version of events I've settled on, because it lets me still call her my daughter. I did not confront her at first. I let the weeks pass. I let Garrett believe that the evening had simply been a strange mishap, a bad reaction to something, bad luck. He seemed, from a distance, to be proceeding as though nothing had collapsed, which told me he didn't know the glass had been switched. When I had everything, every accountant, Every account number, every communication my lawyer had gathered with the help of a private investigator. I contacted the RCMP Financial Crimes Unit. I also contacted the Ontario Securities Commission because some of what Garrett had done touched on securities fraud in the way he'd misrepresented himself to my lawyer's office. The detectives were thorough. They spent 4 months building their case. I cooperated fully. I gave them everything. Garrett was arrested on a Tuesday morning in June outside the commercial real estate office where he worked by 2 plainclothes officers. He was charged with fraud over $5,000, attempted identity fraud, and uttering forged documents. His lawyer would spend the next year negotiating. Nadine called me that evening. She was crying, and for the first 10 minutes, she was angry. Angry at me, which I understood because anger is easier than the other thing. I let her go through it. When she got quiet, I said, "I know you're not a bad person. I also know you knew more than you've said." She didn't deny it. That was something. I told her I would not be cutting her out of my life. I told her I would not be giving her access to anything financial for the foreseeable future. I told her that if she wanted a relationship with me going forward, she would need to speak to someone. A therapist, someone with professional standing. And that I would know whether she was actually doing it or performing doing it. I've known her for 34 years. I told her I wanted her at Christmas. I told her I loved her. I told her she needed to earn the rest. She said she was sorry. She said it in the specific way that means it actually cost her something to say it. I chose to take that for what it was. There's something I haven't mentioned yet because I wanted to wait until I could tell it the way it deserves to be told. The young man at the restaurant, the server who stopped me in the corridor and told me what he'd seen. His name is Owen. He'd been working at Canoe for 8 months, paying off the last of his student debt from Ryerson. He studied supply chain management of all things. I found that out later. The night everything happened, I got his name from the restaurant manager. I sent him a note, handwritten, about 10 days after. I thanked him for what he did, which was a hard thing to do, and told him it had mattered more than he knew. He wrote back, also handwritten, which I respected, and said he'd almost walked past me, that he'd taken 3 steps toward the kitchen and turned around. 3 steps. We had coffee twice after that. He was 26, smart, working a service job because the supply chain company that had offered him a position had done a round of layoffs before his start date. He'd been waiting for another opening, keeping himself afloat. We talked for a long time the second time. I told him more of the story than I'd told most people. I had retained an advisory role with the new owners of my company, a 2-year consulting agreement, part of the deal structure. I recommended Owen for a junior analyst position in their operations team. I made clear that the recommendation was based on his resume and his 2 conversations with me, and that he would have to earn the rest on his own. He understood that. He started in September. I drove to Mississauga last month to see the original warehouse. It's a distribution hub for a meal kit company now. The dock doors I helped install in 1998 are still there. I sat in my car for a while and looked at them. 31 years. A refrigerated truck and a leased building, and a lot of mornings before the city woke up. People ask me sometimes, not often, but sometimes, whether I'm angry. About Nadine, about Garrett, about the dinner. I think about it honestly when they ask. The anger was there. It moved through me like weather in the first weeks. But what I notice now, mostly, is something quieter. A kind of alertness. A permanent revision of assumptions I used to make about the people standing closest to me. I don't think that's a bad thing to carry. I think it makes you more careful about who you let carry something with you. Garrett's sentencing is scheduled for the spring. His lawyer has been working toward a conditional sentence. My lawyer is working against that. I don't spend my days focused on the outcome, but I'll be there when it's read. Nadine was at Christmas. She brought a dish. A sweet potato thing Barbara used to make, from Barbara's recipe card. I don't know where she found that card. I didn't ask. We sat at the same table, and we watched the same snow come down in the backyard, and we were careful with each other in the way people are when they've both broken something and they're still deciding whether to repair it or set it down. I am 63 years old. I have money I will never fully spend. I have a company that no longer needs me, a daughter who is doing the work, and a young man in Mississauga who turned around after 3 steps. That last one is the part I come back to the most. I've had a lot of time to sit with what happened. Not obsessively. I'm past that stage, but in the quiet way you turn a stone over when you're walking and you just want to see what's underneath. What I keep coming back to is this. Nothing that happened to Garrett was accidental. He made choices, one after another, each one a degree worse than the last, and those choices built a structure that eventually collapsed on him. Not because the universe intervened, not because of luck or fate or anything outside of simple cause and effect. He chose to deceive. He chose to plan. He chose to put something in a glass at a dinner table meant to celebrate his own father-in-law. Every one of those choices had a consequence, and the consequences arrived on schedule. That's not a comforting idea, exactly. It doesn't feel like justice in any warm sense. It just feels like arithmetic. What troubles me more, and I think this is the part we're sitting with, is Nadine. Because Nadine didn't make one catastrophic choice. She made 100 small ones. She looked away when she should have looked closer. She told herself a comfortable story about what Garrett was doing and why. She let herself believe that wanting something badly enough made the getting of it acceptable. That's a different kind of failure than what Garrett did, and in some ways, it's harder to name. It doesn't have a charge sheet, it just has consequences. I think about the version of her that existed before Garrett. She was a careful person, a thoughtful person. She used to ask hard questions. Somewhere in 6 years of marriage, she learned to stop asking them. That's what I'd call a failure of intelligence. Not cleverness, she's always been clever. But the deeper kind of intelligence that makes you keep questioning, even when the answers are going to cost you something. And then there's Owen. Owen stopped. He took 3 steps toward the kitchen, and he turned around. He walked up to a stranger, a man he'd never met, whose reaction he couldn't predict. And he said the thing that was true. That is not a small thing. Most people, in that moment, calculate the risk and keep walking. Owen calculated the risk and decided the truth was worth more than the comfort of staying out of it. That's moral courage in its plainest form, and I don't think it's taught anywhere. I think it's just a choice some people make and most don't. What I've learned, or maybe relearned, because I think I knew this once and let it get buried under 30 years of running a company, is that the people closest to you are not automatically the people you can trust. Closeness and trustworthiness are completely different things, and confusing them is one of the most expensive mistakes a person can make. I made it. I made it for years with Garrett. Every time I sat at a table with him and told myself that the unease I felt was my problem to manage. I'm not going to spend the rest of my life being suspicious of everyone. That's not the lesson. The lesson is simpler and harder than that. Pay attention. Not the kind of attention that looks for betrayal behind every corner, but the kind that stays honest about what it sees. The kind that doesn't explain away the feeling that something is wrong just because acknowledging it would be inconvenient. I paid that price. I'm glad I got out the other side of it, and I'm glad Owen turned around